for Mount Desert Island Historical Society. I'm joined today by Patrick Callaway, who is a PhD historian, recent graduate of the University of Maine, and an expert in the early 19th century histories of Canada and the United States. And we're here today to talk about Patrick's article on the War of 1812, titled Uncertain Trumpet, Coastal Mainers, Nova Scotians, and the War of 1812. Patrick, welcome to our ninth issue of Chebacco Chat. Chebacco Chats, we're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it.
And I see you're in the Sound Schoolhouse. That's a different shooting location for most of these events, but good for everybody to see your ordinary home.
It's dry.
Well, you know, Patrick, we want to start right out with a reading from your article, and I think we agreed you'd read the first paragraph to us of Uncertain Trumpet, Coastal Mainers, Nova Scotians, and the War of 1812.
Okay. So the early 19th century was an uncertain time in American history. The consensus resulting from the revolutionary experience gradually collapsed and was replaced with an openly divided political culture. Events in Europe both accelerated this division and created a new geopolitical context for the new republic. The United States was inevitably affected by the war in Europe as American foreign policy interests conflicted with the contradictory demands of Napoleonic Europe and Great Britain. By 1812, the strained relations between the United States and Great Britain devolved into open warfare.
So what you've written for us is, again, like Darcy Stevens' article last week, is in the Chebacco sweet spot of something that, an event that is intensely local, but also has enormous national and international connections and implications. And one of the things I think you do in your article very well is help us understand the national forces at play and the divisions, and also how international events influence what happened here. Can you help us sort out the, beginning with the national divisions that coalesced in the War of 1812, can you help us understand what was going on there among political parties and interests?
Sure. Coming out of the revolution in the 1770s and early 1780s, and culminating with the Constitution in 1787 and 88, the idea was that there would be a consensus, that at least the elites of America had an agreed upon set of ideas, of structures, of what this new government was supposed to do and what the country was supposed to look like. Now that starts to fall apart pretty quickly. There's a number of internal factors, different economic interests between the various sections, even some age and generational gaps, different theoretical ideas on what the role of the citizen in a republic should be, whether there should be a more hierarchical, more ordered society like Great Britain. All of those questions started to come to the forefront because of what we see over in Europe, particularly with the French Revolution, where you have a complete collapse of the old regime of the monarchy and the institution of a Republican form of government. And this reflects on some of the American divides as well, as more conservative Americans are absolutely horrified by the outbreak of violence and the collapse of the French monarchy, while more liberal Americans, later labeled as Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonians, see a great deal of potential there for the elevating of the citizen in a republic. Certainly they deplore some of the excesses, certainly the Reign of Terror and things like that, but overall they see this as a progression towards the future and a new way of doing things. Once we get past the election of 1800, we have the peaceful turnover of power from the Federalist administration of John Adams to the Democratic administration of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson had a very particular take on the French Revolution and tended to support France at the expense of Great Britain. Now, inevitably, the United States gets drawn into this conflict back and forth because of economic interests. The war is incredibly profitable for the United States, particularly United States merchants and shipping interest, because as one of the very few remaining neutral powers in the Atlantic world at this time, the United States has a vast trading relationship with both the British, the French, and those parts of Europe that are becoming occupied by an expanding French Empire in Europe. So this comes to a head in 1807 with the very famous Chesapeake and Leopard incident, where American sailors are conscripted off of an American warship. And as a result, Jefferson imposes a complete embargo on American trade with everybody, by land, by sea, a complete isolation, in order to try to get concessions from particularly Great Britain towards American shipping. And that has some problems. That starts to work in with some of the domestic divisions that we have between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists as political parties, and really even a deeper cultural conflict between merchants who tended to be middle and upper classes and concentrated in New England and in coastal communities, versus Democratic Republicans who tended to be more rural, more agrarian, and situated in the South or in the West. Eventually, this policy collapses. One of the primary losers, so to speak, of the policy was the United States government. At this point in time in history, the American federal government gained about 95% of its income from customs duties. So what happened when he cut off trade through legislative action was that he essentially defunded the American federal government to the deep distress of many. Particularly in New England, this policy is not popular at all and was widely evaded. The first use of the Insurrection Act we've been hearing so much about over the last week or so was actually in 1808 and was directed towards people who were smuggling from Vermont across the border using Lake Champlain into Canada. In Maine, we see something at least semi-similar. Smuggling through the Maine ports into New Brunswick and to Nova Scotia was absolutely epidemic. It was the worst kept secret in the entire state that there was a great deal of smuggling going on. And word of this had filtered all the way back to Washington, where the new president, James Madison, decided that he would order the US Navy to patrol off of the islands in the Maine Gulf, particularly up around Eastport and Moose Island through there, to try to stop smuggling, which did not work at all. The volume of smuggled goods back and forth continued and continued at an ever-increasing rate. So the domestic situation is not particularly good. A lot of economic distress accompanied by a lot of political problems. Now overseas, Napoleon by this time has declared himself Emperor of France in 1804, and his power is expanding all through Europe. So by the time we get to about 1807, 1808, pretty much everything from Lisbon, Portugal, all the way to Eastern Poland was either directly or indirectly under his rule. Great Britain was still at war with Napoleon, Napoleonic France, and Napoleon himself, which created a really strong conflict back and forth. So in 1808, there's an uprising in Portugal, of all places, that the British rushed troops in to support the Portuguese monarchy. The Portuguese monarchy flees to Brazil, which was a Portuguese colony at the time. But now there is an open war between the British and the French, and more the United States is becoming involved, particularly through the means of grain and the grain trade. One of the few sources of surplus bread and flour within the Atlantic world was the United States. So we have this very complex and interesting set of circumstances where trade is being driven not only by economic interest, but also increasingly influenced by political interests. Who gets to trade with who and in what commodities is becoming more and more of a point of confliction, not only domestically, but also between the US government and Napoleon, and the US government and Great Britain. So eventually this comes to a head in 1812. And this is where we start to see a move towards war on the part of the United States.
So this is the fellow we're looking at here is James Madison, and this 1812 war is sometimes called Mr. Madison's War. And we're accustomed, I think, in seeing portraits of Madison to see the young, vibrant guy who helped write the US Constitution. But here this was not a very popular war. And particularly in Down East Maine. Can you describe the local scene? You've kind of gone international, and now let's bring us down to what this looked like here.
So very locally in New England in general, Madison himself was not popular. The Democratic Republican Party was popular in some of the interior areas of the New England, but along the coast, particularly people who depended on shipping in some way, whether it was either directly as merchants and through trade, whether it's through the fisheries, the subsidiary industries in shipbuilding, sail making, all of those different types of spin-off industries from commerce. He was not a very popular person, and his policies, particularly with the inconsistent enforcement and with the inconsistent formulation of policy, created a lot of confusion and a lot of distrust within the marketplace, where people from time to time would not know whether it was legal to trade or if that would be changed by policy that really did not have local interests very much in mind.
So something you wrote in your article was, although Congress could declare a war between nations, it could not declare a war between peoples. And portions of the country, like the coast of Maine, had little interest in a war with Great Britain. So you make the point that even though war was declared, there was this unofficial peace that occurred between the people of Down East Maine in particular and Nova Scotia.
Right. One of the problems that comes out of this declaration of war is that by and large, the people of New England were not for it. The representatives in Congress were not for it. And there was really no coherent case made for why the war was being declared that people could rally behind. So part of it was the fear and complaints about interference with American trade. Part of it was about impressment of American sailors for service in the British Royal Navy. Part of it, if you head towards the west, was about territorial expansion, which really did not impact coastal Maine in any way. Other historians have been a lot less generous about some of the lead up to the war and causes, ranging from confusion to frustration to just absolutely incoherent foreign policy.
So there, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So there really is no cause that people are rallying behind, particularly in places like coastal Maine, which really did not have a cultural conflict that they were interested in pursuing, or a territorial conflict, or a conflict over trade. There was no rallying point that they would be able to subscribe to that says, this is why the war is being fought. So it was much easier, much better economically, much better from the perspective of safety, to reach what we could describe as an informal gentleman's agreement with the British authorities in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to essentially declare peace.
So that it's almost like there's two distinct halves of the war, and the dividing point was an event in Europe that occurred that before it, the situation was, as you described, sort of a gentleman's agreement that trade would occur. But afterwards, the character of the war changed completely. Can you give us that turning point?
Sure. Uh, if we go back to 1812, early 1813, most of the resources of Great Britain were tied up in Europe. The vast majority of the British Army was serving in Portugal and Spain. The vast majority of the British Navy was serving in European waters. And British financial resources were heavily committed to subsidizing the various European empires like Russia, Austria, and Spain to fight against Napoleon. There was very little left over for the Canadas or for Nova Scotia. Very few men, few ships, very little money. But this starts to transition in the late fall of 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig. What happens here is known as the Battle of the Armies. Essentially, this is the major culminating battle between Napoleon, France, and his supporters, and the Austrians, the Prussians, the Russians, all of the people who were fighting against Napoleon. So we're talking about a battle involving hundreds of thousands of men on both sides, with the stakes essentially being the future of Europe. Would it continue to be under the rule of Napoleon, or indirectly or directly through Napoleon? Or would this be a collapse of Napoleon's empire, at least as it related to territories outside of France? And after this climactic 3-day battle, tens of thousands of casualties on both sides, Napoleon eventually loses and starts to withdraw towards France. Accompanying this was a major victory by the Duke of Wellington in Spain, and that campaign that had been ongoing since 1807 and 1808 was drawing to a close as well. So now we have resources available, that there are British troops that can be sent to the Americas, British ships, and perhaps more importantly, money to pay for all of this is becoming available to the British government, who, for various reasons, was willing to engage in another campaign against the United States. So the 1814 campaign.
And that is led by Sir John Sherbrooke. And he really is a difference maker for Down East Maine. And the character of the war changed entirely. Tell us what happened next.
Sure. So Sir John Sherbrooke, he was the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. He was also a military man. He'd been a division commander under Wellington in the peninsula prior to going to Nova Scotia. And really, he was a supporter of that informal gentleman's agreement. Nova Scotia was near indefensible at this time in terms of men and armaments in hand. They needed food supplies from the United States, so he was willing to keep that peace. By the time we get to the start of 1814, there is promises of support from Great Britain. Men, weapons, supplies, and all of those sorts of things. So he starts to put a clamp down on this informal agreement for trade. The license system, essentially the permissions to trade back and forth, are eventually curtailed. And by the time we get to September of 1814, there's been a mass wave of reinforcements from Britain. Thousands of troops pour into the Canadas, and into Halifax comes about 4,000 British troops from Europe. Also coming with them are weapons, supplies, gunpowder, money, all of those things that he had been trying to operate under very constrained circumstances for the previous 18 months of war. And now that is just no longer the case.
And that's what we had the event that Bill Horner talked about a few weeks ago, the Battle of Norwood Cove. If anybody's interested in seeing that, it's on our YouTube channel and our Facebook Live page. But Sherbrooke had a particular goal in mind, and that was the control of the Penobscot, and that put him at Castine, right?
Yes, so part of the goal that he had was manyfold. Coming out of the Revolution, the exact boundary between Maine and British North America was not clearly defined. When the peace treaty was made, it had not been adequately surveyed, so this is a disputed territory that they had been negotiating back and forth over. If we go back to the colonial era, this had been sort of a de facto boundary between empires drawn at the line of the Penobscot anyway, so there is a historical element to it. If we go to 1779 in the first Castine expedition, that was going to be the boundary line prior to negotiations at the end of the war. So Castine is a very key port. It's one of the few deep water ports along the coast of Maine that the British Navy could get into, get out of, and actually be defended at. So the Penobscot would make a much more defensible border than the St. Croix. So that's part of it. And the idea for Sherbrooke and others was that if they controlled Castine and the line of the Penobscot, then everything down East Maine would be easier to control. Now, originally, that would not have been quite the deal that it becomes, but what they discovered in 1812 and 1813 was that it was possible to get by land from New Brunswick across what is now northern Maine and to Quebec. With the St. Lawrence freezing over regularly and shutting down communications for months on end, that road becomes very important militarily. So control over what was then Washington County, Maine, has a war purpose that it did not previously. So that becomes the key spot. So the war turns to there, and in a very short expedition lasting less than 2 weeks, a force arrives at Castine. The American defending army, numbering about 40 men or so, at Fort Madison, fires one shot for the honor of the flag and promptly flees. So in a very famous case, the town minister, a guy by the name of Parson Mason, grabs his tablecloths, runs out to a ship or to a boat in the harbor, rows out and surrenders the town. So meanwhile, an American war vessel, the USS Adams, had run aground off of a rock on the coast of Maine and had fled up the Penobscot to what is now present-day Hamden. So that would have been a serious threat to British control in the area and British shipping. So they send an expedition up to Hamden and Bangor. After a very short battle, the British are victorious, the Adams is destroyed, and all of Maine east of the Penobscot is surrendered to the British. This is, sorry?
I said, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty decisive. By this point in time, the United States Army was stretched absolutely drum tight. Most of the troops are in New York along the Niagara frontier or out west. There was not going to be a relief army coming. So essentially, I guess crudely we could put it, there was a business decision made that since there was no hope of outside rescue, that it was better just to surrender under relatively good terms and try to make the best of that situation while there's negotiations in Europe over that boundary line.
So the alternative for people who are living here, who had their farms, is they could resist or have their livelihoods burned.
Right, so there was not going to be an organized resistance. The militia had been pretty well scattered. There were no regulars coming. And they have essentially the choice of either fleeing across the Penobscot and leaving behind their homes and their farms and all of the things they had, or they could remain peaceable and try to make an accommodation with this incoming force.
So, Patrick, our time always runs out in a hurry, but I want you to give us the wrap up to the war. We move on to other phases of life for Maine and the United States. What were the longer term consequences of these events?
So for Maine, the administration was relatively light in terms of direct control. All of the structures remained in place, the political structures and all of that. Trade continues, and one of the more interesting outcomes of this entire scenario was the Dalhousie library. So the British had set up a customs house in Castine, and there was so much trade going back and forth between the US and Castine that it almost collapsed the American banking system and provided enough customs income to start a library. Territorially, there was not a change. The Treaty of Ghent, which is signed on Christmas Eve 1814, returns the territory to the United States. Realistically, at this point in time, after 20 years of war, the British are exhausted. The United States, it's very questionable if an American army could be put in the field in 1815. So out of mutual exhaustion, the choice is made out at this treaty that the war would end and that there would be no territorial adjustments that take place.
Well, I want to invite our listeners to correspond with us by Zoom on through the chat function or questions and answers, and on Facebook if you have any questions for us. Patrick, did that plaque that you showed us at Dalhousie, did you know about that, or did you encounter that wandering across that campus when you were studying there a couple of years ago?
I knew that it was there. It was one of the first things that I actually got drawn to when I started my PhD, now censored numbers of years ago, was that very interesting combination of American money and this library that shows up in Halifax. So I knew it was there, but to see the plaque was pretty interesting.
Yes, and you've also done some work in Castine. So what do you think that people who are here to, or have access and want to get out of here for a little bit and visit Castine, what are some of the things we ought to note about the importance of that community?
Well, in this era, the primary thing is the harbor, which is pretty much the place from the first discoveries of Champlain and all the way up through the 1820s, 1830s. The harbor is the primary strategic thing. The earthworks of Fort Madison are still there. It's one of my favorite spots along the coast. And the earthworks of Fort George, which was the fort put in place in 1779 and up through 1784, subsequently remodeled multiple times, that's still there in town.
Well, Muriel Davison writes, greetings, and tell us about some of your other work. For instance, Muriel's note reminds me that you're recently added to the board at the Tremont Historical Society.
This is true. Finished up the PhD, so finally that never-ending project is off of my desk. I'm still going through some of the things that I found in the archives up in the Provincial Archives of Nova Scotia, particularly related to some of the earlier times in the 1750s and 60s. So still working with some of that. I'm revising an article based at least somewhat on the presentation today with the trade between the US and the British Army in Portugal. So that's a work in progress. So it's around the same period, but not the same project, thankfully.
Yeah, yeah. And you're teaching as well.
Yes, I have a class that I'll be teaching over the summer on European history from mid-1700s through the end of Napoleon. And I'll be back at it again in the fall, either online or in person, we're not sure, at the University of Maine, teaching a class on pandemics in American history, and another session of Western Civilization 2.
And all of this is on top of your work as collections manager for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. Looks like we've got part of the collection behind you there.
Yes. This is the schoolhouse for the folks with us that haven't been in for a while.
Well, it looks like you have a very multifaceted life with lots of different interests. And it's amazing, again, how fast time goes here. But we're about the end of our half hour. Patrick, I want to thank you for writing this wonderful article. If you're listening and you want to get hold of it, you can get a copy via our website, mdihistory.org. And I'm sure if you have questions about this episode, you can correspond with us via our Facebook page, and we can put Patrick to answering those questions. I want to thank everyone for participating. Patrick, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
We'll be back next week, next Thursday, with a speaker to be announced. We're still working on arrangements for that. Thank you all for coming. Take care of each other. We'll see you next week.
And thank you.